Hello, guys. This is André Soares, Senior Fellow here at SEBRE, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. We are here for another SEBRE Online. This one, we're going to talk about the United States response to the COVID crisis, to the coronavirus crisis. And for our talk, we have a very special guest with us. We have Fernando Kutz. Fernando is a senior fellow, a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He's also a senior associate at the Cohen Group, and he served as a senior advisor for international affairs in Western Hemisphere at the White House, and he actually served in both administrations, Obama and Trump administration. I'm very glad we have Fernando with us that I welcome to our talk.
Thank you very much, André. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
So, Fernando, the idea of this talk this afternoon is to go more into details of how the U.S. is responding to the crisis. We all know as of now that the United States is the epicenter of the crisis in the world, of the coronavirus crisis in the world. You have more than 470,000 cases, confirmed cases here in the country. Unfortunately, there are more than 18,000 deaths as of when we're talking right now. And the first case that we had in the US was in late January. So it's been a couple months now, at least, that this crisis has been an ongoing crisis. The Trump administration has dealt with this crisis as a war crisis. They call it the virus an invisible enemy, and he actually calls himself a wartime president. And the idea here is to try to understand what are first the impact, the political impact of this big crisis that is going on in the United States and its ramifications, not only on the political scene, but also on the elections. And then we're going to talk about the economy and foreign affairs. So I would like to start our talk more on the response to the crisis. I think the whole world has been following what's going on here in the US. You have these daily briefs given by the president. We had like a historical moment, I think like a couple weeks ago, when the president came on public saying that it would be possible for 100 to 200,000 people to die from this crisis. From this virus. You already have, I think, more than 250 million Americans that are under certain level of social isolation right now. And I would like to start with you, try to understand how do you see the government's response to the crisis? Is the social isolation measures actually working? Can we see the government's been able to, the government, I say like the collective government and society has been able to flatten the curve here in the United States?
Well, yeah, no, and I think, as you said, we all know that the crisis has, what began in China, moved to Europe, I think principally Italy and Spain, and now the epicenter of this whole crisis seems to be the United States. More specifically, even within the United States right now, it's the state of New York. It's been a very, very challenging couple of weeks for the United States. I think American people are realizing that there are a lot more challenges that we have to deal with within our healthcare system and within our many different social nets that we thought were perhaps stronger or perhaps more resilient and more prepared than what we're finding out now. We're finding out that we have shortages of a number of issues, a number of whether it's personal protective equipment for doctors and nurses and firefighters and paramedics, or whether it's ventilators that can keep people alive longer, especially during this specific crisis. We're seeing some real shortages in our system, and I think that's been surprising to most Americans. As far as the government response goes, I think that you've seen a very big change in how the government has responded from the beginning, early days to where we are now. In the early days, you saw President Trump very much minimizing the COVID-19 crisis, claiming that it would at first potentially not impact Americans, and then kind of hoping or claiming that there would be some sort of miracle cure that would come, whether it's from the weather getting warmer, or whether it's from some sort of medication or vaccination that might appear out of nowhere. Things that I think most medical experts and public health officials claimed were not helpful for the president to be saying. However, I think there was a shift in how the president approached this. And I think in part, that shift came from a realization, politically speaking, that in an election year where Americans will be going out to the polls in November to vote for the president or not for the president, he realized that his entire pitch up until now, which had been one of economic gain and low unemployment rates, would essentially be destroyed. He realized that that could no longer be his pitch moving forward. And that therefore his new pitch had to be one that, as you mentioned, of essentially a wartime presidency, one where he was able to unite the country around this crisis, and therefore, ideally in his mind, surge politically from that unity that he would bring to the country. And so I think when him and his advisors came to that realization that this crisis was truly inevitable and that he could no longer undermine it, but instead, for his own survival, political survival, he had to, in fact, embrace it fully, that's when you saw the president go out there and start acting in a somber and responsible way, with numbers that were truly scary to most Americans, but were realistic. And with actions and decisions that were hugely consequential to the American economy, but again, necessary in order to save lives. So have we flattened the curve? Well, I think it might be a little early to say that for sure, but it does seem like there are positive indications. We're seeing that while the number of deaths in the United States is still very, very high every single day, in fact, I think we keep breaking new records most days, certainly the last couple of days. The number of new patients going into hospitals is actually on the decline in hot spots around the country, especially New York and New Jersey. Now, the question is, will new hotspots emerge? There are cities like Detroit and Michigan, like New Orleans and Louisiana, like DC, here the nation's capital, that are quickly emerging as potential new hotspots. So it's a very large country, and I think a lot of people forget that we're bigger in size and scope than all of Europe combined, right? So you could fix the problem in New York, but not necessarily have fixed it in other parts of the country. Having said that, it seems like the government is finally taking this problem very seriously. Seems like the American machinery, the American production capabilities are all shifted now towards trying to deal with this crisis. And I think that when the United States government, the American people, and American businesses all decide that they have to address a certain topic, a certain issue, be it World War II, where the country all united around and rallied around the production that was needed for us to be able to get into that war and defeat the Nazis and win that war, or be it now with COVID-19. I think that once that unity came about, then surely we will defeat this thing, and I think I am hopeful that that curve is indeed flattening as we speak.
And Fernando, do you think that we are getting close to finding that unity? Because I understand, I'm also based here in the United States, that you have some difference and some heterogeneity within like the different states and cities. You have governors that are like Governor Cuomo from New York that is doing a great job in trying to fight the infections there. But you also have governors in other states that to a certain extent may be reflecting this early stage that President Trump also had in his response to the crisis. So do you think we're far away from finding unity, or we're close there as of now, as we speak?
Absolutely. I think there's two answers to that question. As a culture, I think we're very united. And in fact, I'd argue that this is even transcending boundaries, right? Transcending just one country or another. The incredible thing about this virus is that it is truly global in a way that I don't think we've seen another scandal or pandemic or a crisis that we've faced as a civilization in many decades be. So whether you are in the United States or you're in Brazil or you're in China or you're in France, we all seem to be going through the same thing right now together. And in a way that brings a very close-knit spirit, and it makes us all closer together. And I think there's a natural tendency to rally around one another and to get stronger in our communities and to really help one another out in a way that you don't see in a day-to-day. Having said that, I think with the government levels, you're seeing that rallying around a leader really play out with governors. And you're not necessarily seeing it play out with the president. I think the president at first received a big bounce in his numbers. It went up pretty drastically to the highest approval rating that he's had in his entire presidency. Immediately following him really starting to take this crisis seriously, asking for governors to lock down their states, and again, issuing those strong declarations about the potential number of dead in the United States, 100 to 200,000. He seemed to turn the curve, and Americans, again, in a time of crisis, want to rally around their leader. However, soon enough, the president went back to his normal ways, and instead of being a uniter, he started becoming a divider. And that's not just along partisan lines, even within Republican Party politics. When Mitt Romney, senator out of Utah, his wife has some pre-existing health conditions. And when Senator Romney isolated himself because he was worried about exposure to another senator who tested positive, instead of offering kind words of some sort, the president went on the attack and criticized him and made fun of him. And I think it's actions like those. He's also been very critical of the governor of Michigan, who's this rising star female within the Democratic Party, and who's, by all accounts, within the population of Michigan, been doing a phenomenal job. So again, those kinds of divisive attacks that the president has been so fond of the last 3 years of his presidency, they may have worked for him politically in that era, but I think in the current crisis, where people want to see government working together effectively for the good of the people, it's just not playing very well. So I don't think the country has rallied around the president, and in fact, things might be backfiring with the president. However, at the governor level, we're seeing some real rallying around most governors. And whether it's Governor Cuomo in New York or almost any other governor, we're seeing approval ratings just completely shoot up, anywhere from the 60% range to as high as 85% for governors who maybe just a month or two ago were polling in the 40s or 50%. So that, again, desire for unity is there, but we need leaders who actually push for that unity and not push away from it.
Okay, thank you, Fernando. I want to dive deeper into one thing that you brought it up, which is the miracle cure, which I think we're all hoping and expecting that can come soon. I understand there's a global race right now for a vaccine, but I think that the best prospects that we have indicate that we're only going to have a vaccine early next year and not exactly within the 10 to 12 months window that we have ahead of us. But until we get there, there has been like a very deal of discussion about therapeutics of how you can treat this virus. And one that has emerged is the use of hydroxychloroquine, which is a medication for malaria. And in Brazil right now, we have a great national discussion, actually a very heated discussion in Brazil about the use of this medicine and whether or not the government should encourage the use of this drug. And I want to hear a little bit from you. How is this discussion happening in the US? Do you see the same heated discussion going on here, and how are the different political players that are in charge of regulating and also encouraging the use of drugs are acting, especially like FDA and CDC and so on?
In the United States, there seems to be a very clear divide amongst those who are proposing the use of that drug right now and those that are being more cautious. The scientific community, and that is playing out through the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the FDA, the Health and Human Services Secretariat, and the National Institute of Health. Every real member that I've seen of the scientific and medical community is urging strong caution for now on the use of this drug. And The reason is that we have some anecdotal evidence from doctors here and there who are saying that this drug has worked or has worked to better the condition of some patients. But we also have some anecdotal evidence that says that this drug can be dangerous, especially for patients who might have a heart condition or patients who perhaps didn't know they had a heart condition and will find out under these circumstances. So in the absence of controlled trials and controlled studies, there has been a hesitation from the medical community and the scientific community to really encourage the use of this drug for now. However, it seems like in the political community, there is a strong push among some, and particularly President Trump and a lot of his friends and allies, that this drug should be used because there is no time to spare awaiting these kinds of clinical trials and other tests that might be run in a normal era, but that right now they say if we wait for, we could be costing lives unnecessarily. You know, it's a very tough debate. I tend to listen to the scientists and doctors over politicians when it comes to matters of you know, whether or not I should take a drug. Having said that, I also understand the point of the politicians, which is, you know, we don't want to be overly cautious at this point in time, but we do want to be safe for the general population. So I think we need to balance these two, and I think that there's also some argument to be made on the political side that giving the people hope at a time that you're seeing so much death and despair has some value. But again, we don't want to give false hope, and we certainly don't want to encourage anybody to potentially end up harming themselves by use of a drug that they have no business using. So again, I think you have to balance the two, and you have to be clear with what the actual scientific facts and evidence is. And as of right now, my understanding at least is that the evidence has not pointed directly and conclusively to this drug being a cure.
Okay, and shifting gears a little bit to something that you mentioned before about elections. We are in an election year here in the United States, and we heard these days that candidate Bernie Sanders just decided to leave the race for the primaries in the Democratic campaign. My personal impression is that the election this year, as you mentioned, is probably going to be a validation on the government's response to the crisis. But I wanted to hear a little bit from you about how do you think that where the elections are going to go? I know that you've been involved in some of the primary campaigns, and what's the strategy from the Democrats now? Because I think the whole game changed. It's not about, I feel like the impeachment that we saw here and everything that happened before happened in like 10 years ago. Where it's a total new ball game as of now. So I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I completely agree with you. It's the first 3 years of this presidency seem to no longer matter. I think that the election happening in November here will be very much a forum on what people think of how President Trump reacted to this crisis. You know, there are, I think, some questions that will still play a role in this that are probably beyond the president's control. There are some forecasts out there saying that unemployment rate in the United States will be anywhere from 20% to perhaps even 25%, matching the rate of the Great Depression. You know, and if that's the case, maybe even if people think the president's handling this crisis relatively well, they won't be as forgiving, because at the end of the day, we all know that the vote tends to match the economy and people's pocketbooks. So it might be very hard for him to swing a re-election with unemployment rates that high. However, I think the majority of the focus will truly be on how he handles this directly. And I think that, again, that is a question that's still very much up in the air. If you looked at polls from about 3 weeks ago, you would say that the president's going to get quite a bit of a bump because of this crisis, and that he would actually surge and likely be reelected fairly well. But if you look at polls that have come out in that past few days, you're actually seeing that people are no longer thinking the president's doing a good job with the crisis. They think that he's sometimes overruling his medical advisors and that he's again being too much of a showman in these press conferences he holds that go on for sometimes an hour and a half every single day, 7 days a week, and so that could very well backfire on him as well. So I do think that at the end of the day, it's these coming weeks and perhaps months, and how he acts, and how does he bring the economy back, but how is that also weighed with the health of people, right? Because if he brings the economy back too quickly, and all of a sudden we're all sheltering at home again, and after another 1,000 deaths or 10,000 deaths, God forbid, then that could also backfire on him. So he's in a very delicate spot. But I do think that the election or re-election of President Trump is pretty much now all in the hands of President Trump. I think that former Vice President Biden is I'm sure he's going to have a strong campaign to the extent that he can, but it's going to be a very truncated campaign that's probably not going to really kick off again until July or August, which is perhaps the shortest campaign in the history of the United States before that November election. So the opportunities he will have will be very, very limited. I think people will really vote based on their understanding and their belief of how President Trump has acted.
I have a follow-up question there, because as we have talked before, there are these emerging leaders that are getting national attention now, like the governments that you mentioned, and I think like two of them on the Democratic side of the aisle are getting a lot of attention, the governor of New York and the governor of California. Do you think that we can expect any kind of surprise there, like maybe like not going with Joe Biden and getting like a Cuomo or Gavin Nelson?
Mm-hmm. I think that's really unlikely at this point. I know that there's been this kind of surge of popularity for Governor Cuomo, Governor Newsom, who have, I think, both done outstanding jobs in their states, and I think to the benefit of the country as a whole. They've been very public about what they've been saying and doing, and that's been watched carefully, I think, by the whole country, and so I think their popularity is absolutely and rightfully surging right now across the country. Having said that, there is a very deliberate process that folks go through here when they run for president for one of the two main parties that we have. And within the Democratic Party, that process has been playing out now for almost 2 years in total, but certainly when the votes being cast, that's been happening since January. The delegates are pre-assigned now based on the votes that each state has cast, which means that unless Vice President Biden chooses to withdraw or something happens to him that forces him to withdraw, I think that the delegate count is now there for him to be the nominee for president for the Democratic Party. And I don't envision either one of those two governors wanting to run as an independent or something like that, which would most likely just split the Democratic vote and end up making it an easy race for President Trump. Okay.
So let's go now to the second, I think the second tsunami that has hit like all of us, which is the economic impact of this virus, and where I think it's an area different from the elections here in the US that you're going to have a lot of surprises with what is coming. You mentioned some numbers of unemployment. I think as of now, more than 60 million Americans have applied to jobless insurance and help. I wrote like the guideline for an interview like a couple of days ago, and and when I wrote the JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs were expecting a drop in GDP of the order of 30%, and today they already released a new one saying that GDP in this quarter may drop 40%, more than they even expected last week. But in response to that, which I also think you mentioned, you have this very strong response, not only from the administration with Secretary Mnuchin, but also with Congress. I think both have aligned there, and they came up with phase 3 of this response, which is the most famous phase around the world. It's the $2 trillion response to the crisis. And I want to understand a little bit, how do you see this response? Is it actually having an effect on the economy? Can we expect that is the amount of money enough to help small business and help people stay at home? Because ultimately, if people don't get their money, they're going to try to go out and try to figure out any kind of way to get survive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think there's so much that is unknown right now about this crisis because it's so unlike any other economic crisis that we have dealt with. Uh, it seems to me like the fundamentals of our economy are still strong, and that's the good news. Unlike in 2008, where we saw the housing crisis, or unlike the 90s, where we saw the dot-com bust, or most of these kind of previous crises, we have not seen, so far at least, any kind of fundamental flaw in our economy that is truly leading to kind of this downfall, right? It seems to be just a pandemic, which of course is horrible, but ideally, hopefully, is temporary. So there is certainly a line of thought out there that once this thing is behind us, and the big question mark, of course, is when will that be? Will it be May, or as some people are hoping for, or perhaps June, or will it be sometime in the fall, or maybe even sometime in 2021 when we've actually found some sort of vaccine for it, right? But whenever this thing is behind us, there's a line of thought, and I haven't seen a reason not to buy it, that our economy will come roaring back. Because again, there will be, I think, pent-up demand, and hopefully, again, without any kind of fundamental flaws in our economy being exposed, we're able to just kick things back into gear. Having said that, it seems more and more likely that we're not going to be able to just turn the switch back on come May or June, right? I mean, this will most likely be a phased approach to returning to work, returning to our economy, and that might be a prolonged phased approach. And depending on how long this goes, it could certainly spell more and more trouble to the companies that are particularly hard hit by this crisis, those in the tourism industry, those in the retail industry. So I think there are a lot of question marks still to be answered. Having said that, I think the response so far from the U.S. government, from Congress, from the Federal Reserve, from the Treasury Department have been incredibly strong, strongest in the history of the United States or of the world for that matter. And it's, I think, boosted confidence for Americans and for small businesses and for large businesses to see that kind of quick and unanimous response from the United States. When you look at the Europeans as an example, it wasn't until yesterday, right, that they finally were able to come together and agree on some sort of economic rescue package, and it's unclear if it's even enough. Here, within days, we had this bipartisan $2 trillion package approved out the door, and not only do most economists think it will be enough for the short term, but Congress and the president and everybody have been very clear that if it isn't, they're going to go back and do a phase 4. And in fact, likely a phase 4 will happen no matter what. So I think that has boosted confidence, and that has allowed for our economy to not completely collapse despite what's going on.
Yeah, I really hope it's a matter of switch on and off, and we're actually able to get things back. Not 100% like they used to be, but the closest possible. Not only for American economy to be good for Americans, but also to the rest of the world, because the U.S. imports and exports and invests in a lot of countries across the globe. And talking about the rest of the world, I want to move to the last part of our interview that is related to the U.S. relations to other countries and how the U.S. is dealing with its allies and within this crisis, right? With this crisis. My first question in that area is related to China. We also see that China is cooperating with the U.S. There are reports of Chinese flights coming to the U.S. with medical supplies and try to help the U.S. and not only the U.S. but Europe in this moment of crisis. So I wanted to hear from you, how has this relationship played out? Are we in the good side of it, or it's cooperation or conflict, or cooperation and conflict at the same time?
Yes, the U.S. relationship with China under the Trump administration has been a real roller coaster. And so I think your point is right of, where are we at this very moment, but by next week we might be in a completely different place. So it's hard to pinpoint it too exactly. President Trump, I think, sees the Chinese as economic aggressors for the United States in general. And so I think he has done frankly, something that I think many administrations before have talked about doing, but have never done before, which is to really hammer down on the Chinese and say, you cannot keep doing things the way that you've been doing. You cannot steal some of our technologies or force some of our companies to turn some of their proprietary information over, or send people into the United States to steal technology or information from our labs or businesses. So I think he's been very, very hard on that, and it's for the most part been bipartisanly praised, to be honest. However, I think that there are also times where cooperation is essential. We are still the world's two largest economies, and while I think having some healthy competition can be good, and while certainly setting some clear rules for engagement can be a good thing for both sides, I also think that there needs to be room for cooperation, and I think that what we're seeing here, again, it's not regardless of where this originated geographically, this crisis is a global one. It's a pandemic that's really taken over the world. And so I think it's important, not just for the United States and China, but for the whole world to work closely together. It's when we all come together and we use our scientific expertise and we use our medical expertise and we use our production capabilities together. Because these days supply chains run so globally that you really can't hoard any one item or any one manufacturing plant without having the risk of things getting hoarded against you. And we can all just shut each other down if we wanted to, but that's not going to benefit anybody and certainly not going to save any lives. But to the extent that we can all work together, including, of course, between us and the Chinese, the two largest economies in the world, I think it's essential that we do so as quickly as possible for all the lives that are at risk.
And one last question: how do you see the U.S. relationship with Brazil under this crisis? And in what area do you see that both governments and societies could cooperate now?
Well, I think President Bolsonaro seems to have also taken a very different approach to this crisis from most of the world, where he, I think, despite many others within his government who are taking this very, very seriously, he seems to personally be downplaying it a bit, and I think that's unfortunate. Having said that, I think in a government-to-government level, that will transcend the kind of presidential level and that top level. And you'll see a lot of cooperation that is probably happening behind the scenes already. I'm sure that our scientists are cooperating. I'm sure that our companies are working closely together, transporting goods and services amongst themselves that are essential to the current crisis, whether it's masks and gloves and aprons, or whether it's ventilators or anything else. And just like we have such a strong bilateral relationship and trade relationship, on so many different things, that cultural bond between our countries are also very strong. And so I have no doubt that Brazil, which has some of the best scientists in the world, some of the best doctors and hospitals in the world, will be cooperating and collaborating closely with the United States, which also, of course, has some of the best scientists and doctors and hospitals in the world. Again, sometimes we don't need the governments to get involved for that to happen. In fact, sometimes it's best when the governments get out of the way for that to happen. So, I have no doubt that that's happening behind the scenes. But, generally speaking, I think the perception here is one that is unfortunate about what President Bolsonaro has been saying, and I think there's a real belief that that again it could cost lives in Brazil. And so I think I'm hopeful that the people of Brazil are listening to the Minister of Health and many other experts in the country who I think have been clear-eyed about the crisis and have been giving the best possible advice to save as many lives as possible.
Okay, perfect. So Fernando, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate the talk that we had. I think that this topic and this virus is changing the world, and not only myself, but other fellows of the CEBRI will come back to this issue in other CEBRI onlines, and I hope we can count you in the future for future conversations as well. Thank you very much, Fernando.
Of course. Thank you very much, Andrea. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for have been like seeing and listening to us. Bye. Ciao.